There are stories that do not simply fade, they are buried, covered, forgotten by design, not by accident. The history of the Moors is one such story, a chapter of human civilization so luminous, so transformative, that its erasure was necessary for later European identity to stand unchallenged. For nearly 7 centuries, African and Afro-Arab scholars, architects, poets, engineers, philosophers, and physicians ruled much of Spain and Portugal. Their world was not one of darkness or chaos, but of knowledge, innovation, and radiant beauty. What Europe would later call its rebirth, the Renaissance, began under Moorish light. But the world does not remember what does not serve its illusions. We remember the palaces of Granada, the arches of Cordoba, the mosaics of Seville, yet we forget the hands that carved, studied, calculated, and envisioned them. We remember the Spanish guitar, yet forget the African ode and the rhythmic scales that shaped its melodies. We marvel at universities and hospitals in medieval Europe, yet seldom ask, who built the first ones there? This is not simply a missing footnote, it is the missing foundation. To restore this history is not to change the past, it is to finally see it clearly. And so our journey begins, not in Spain, but in Europe before the Moors arrived. Before the Moors crossed the sea, Europe was a world dimmed by loss. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire left behind a fractured landscape of warlords, famine, superstition, and disease. Cities crumbled, roads decayed, libraries burned. The knowledge of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and philosophy, once preserved in the ancient world, had nearly disappeared. A silence fell, not a silence of peace, but a forgetting. Europe was not a cradle of enlightenment at this time. It was a continent searching for memory. In many regions, literacy fell to nearly zero outside monasteries. Scholars were rare, and books were rarer still. The average person lived a life circumscribed by survival, harsh winters, failed harvests, sickness without remedy. Infant mortality soared. The average lifespan hovered in the 30s. Disease swept through towns with little resistance, misunderstood and feared as divine punishment rather than biological reality. Even basic hygiene vanished. Bathing, once commonplace in the Roman world, became associated with illness and sin. People believed that warm water opened the pores of the skin and allowed sickness to enter the body. To bathe was to endanger one's soul and health. Centuries later, in the 17th century, France's King Louis XIV, the Sun King, was known for rarely bathing, instead masking odor with perfume and linen. Some accounts claim he bathed only twice in his life. Whether literal or exaggerated, it reflects a culture in which cleanliness had become foreign. This was Europe's state, a continent dimming. But across the sea, a different world was rising. A world of libraries, gardens, learning, faith, architecture, medicine. A world where bathing was spiritual, where knowledge was sacred. A world ready to cross the waters and change history forever. And so, the tide turned. In the year 711 AD, a decisive moment reshaped history. The Moors, a people of African and Afro-Arab descent, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar under the leadership of Tariq ibn Ziyad. His troops were not driven by chance. They carried with them a tradition of scholarship, statecraft, architecture, and faith. They came from lands where light still shone, where learning was alive, where libraries had not been reduced to ash. They came not to destroy a world, but to reshape it. When Tariq reached the Iberian Peninsula, he made a choice that became legend. He ordered his fleet of ships burned, leaving no possibility of retreat. Then he addressed his soldiers with words that still echo through time. Behind you is the sea. Before you is the enemy. You have no path but forward, victory, or the sea. It was not merely a military tactic, it was the declaration of a new era. This land would not simply be conquered, it would be transformed. The place where Tariq landed is known today as Gibraltar, derived from the Arabic Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. The land itself still carries his name, though the world is slow to remember the man behind it. Yet, his crossing marked the beginning of a civilization that would illuminate Europe for centuries. And so the Moors advanced, but they did not raze cities to the ground. They rebuilt them. They repaired aqueducts, restored agriculture, revived trade routes, and reopened the gates of learning. They brought engineers where there were soldiers, scholars where there was silence, physicians where there was plague. The darkened continent had met the torchbearers. Light was returning. To see that light most clearly, we look to the city that became its glowing heart. Spain did not merely change, it blossomed. Under Moorish guidance, cities grew into centers of thought, beauty, and daily life that astonished travelers from around the world. Cordoba, once a provincial town, became the largest and most advanced city in Europe. It boasted paved streets, public street lighting, water channels, lush gardens, and marketplaces overflowing with goods from Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. One of the most profound contributions was public hygiene. The Moors built hundreds of public bathhouses, not as luxuries, but as necessities of life. Cleanliness was not vanity, it was spiritual dignity. To wash the body was to honor the soul. In a Europe where many associated water with sickness, the Moors restored the understanding that cleanliness was health. They introduced soap making, steam bathing, scented oils, and heated marble baths. Europeans would later describe them as the clean people. Education flourished. Girls and boys alike were taught literacy, mathematics, science, and theology. Universities opened their doors not only to elites, but to common citizens. Cordoba alone housed more than 70 libraries, while the largest contained over 600,000 manuscripts, dwarfing the entire literary holdings of Northern Europe. Knowledge was not guarded, it was shared. Studying was worship. Learning was cultural obligation. But the beauty of Al-Andalus was not simply intellectual, it was poetic. Gardens were designed to represent paradise. Architecture mirrored the symmetry of divine order. Poetry and music flowed in the streets. Life was not merely lived, it was cultivated. A new civilization had taken root, and it would feed the world. From the gardens and libraries of Al-Andalus, knowledge began to move outward, northward, into a world waiting to be awakened. Cordoba became the beating heart of this new civilization, a city where the flame of learning burned without fear of darkness. Scholars journeyed from Africa, Arabia, Persia, and even the distant corners of Europe to study there. In its universities, knowledge was not chained by ideology or fear. It was allowed to breathe, to expand, to interact with cultures and traditions from across the known world. Physicians studied anatomy and herbal medicine. Mathematicians refined algebra and trigonometry. Astronomers charted the heavens with instruments of astonishing precision. Knowledge was not merely preserved, it evolved. Here, scholarship was an act of devotion. A person who sought knowledge was believed to be walking a sacred path, illuminating the mind and refining the soul. Teachers and students prayed together, debated together, explored together. A physician might also be a poet. A philosopher might also be a musician. Knowledge was not boxed into rigid compartments. It flowed, interconnected, like the irrigation channels that nourished the gardens of the city. To learn was to live fully, to expand one's inner horizon. Thousands of manuscripts were copied and translated. Works from ancient Kemet, Carthage, Greece, Persia, India, and West Africa were gathered and preserved. This was not an age of intellectual competition, it was an age of intellectual blossoming. The Moors understood something timeless, that wisdom is not the property of one people, one land, or one tongue. Wisdom is a river that flows through humanity, and they chose not to block the river, but to widen it. From Cordoba, the flame of knowledge began to travel north. Scholars from France, England, Italy, and Germany made pilgrimages to learn from Moorish teachers. They returned home carrying new ideas, new mathematics, new medicine, new architecture, new ways of thinking. And though Europe would later claim the renaissance of its mind as self-born, the spark that rekindled European consciousness was lit in the libraries of Al-Andalus. And where knowledge flourished, beauty followed, not merely in appearance, but in the very spirit of daily life. The Moors believed that beauty was not a luxury, it was a form of remembrance. To shape one's environment with care, balance, and harmony was to honor the Creator. Their architecture reflected this belief with exquisite tenderness. Arches curved like rising moons. Courtyards were designed around flowing fountains, so water would speak softly throughout the day. Walls were inscribed with poetry, scripture, and geometric patterns that drew the eye into meditative contemplation. The goal was not to impress, but to inspire peace. Homes were built around inner gardens so that family life was sheltered, calm, and in communion with green spaces and water. Rooms opened into each other gently, like thoughts unfolding in prayer. Public buildings were designed with acoustics that allowed words, songs, and recitations to float clearly, as if lifted by unseen wings. In this world, architecture was not stone and mortar. It was emotion, translated into form. Music, too, became an expression of the soul. The rhythmic patterns of West Africa blended with the tones of the oud, the flute, and the lute. Songs carried stories of longing, gratitude, devotion, and love. From this fusion, the foundations of flamenco emerged, a music of passion, memory, and ancestral echo. Even today, in the voice of a flamenco singer, one can hear the faint vibration of desert winds and Sahelian drums. The Moors did not erase cultures, they wove them together. Food, clothing, social customs, all reflected an art of living that valued grace and moderation. To eat was to thank the earth. To speak was to uplift. To gather was to belong. Life under the Moors was not perfect. No human society is. But it was a world where beauty was considered both nourishment and prayer. It was a civilization that remembered that the soul, too, must be fed. Yet even the brightest gardens cast shadows, and the story of Al-Andalus was always accompanied by a quiet, growing resistance. As the centuries unfolded, forces beyond the gardens of Andalusia began to shift. The Christian kingdoms of northern Spain, once fragmented and weakened, gradually regained strength. Driven by a merging of political ambition and religious fervor, they began to push southward. This was not an overnight struggle. It took more than 700 years. But with each generation, the borders of Al-Andalus grew smaller. Yet resistance did not break the spirit of the Moors. Cities adapted, cultures blended, and life continued. Even as territory was lost, art, science, and philosophy continued to flourish. It is a testament to the resilience of this civilization that its golden age lasted centuries longer than many empires combined. But time wears on all things, and history moves like a tide, rising and receding in rhythms we cannot always see until they have passed. The Christian Reconquista was not merely a military campaign, it was an ideological one. As Christian rulers gained ground, they began to rewrite the narrative of the land. The history, identity, and contributions of Africans in Spain became a threat, not to the survival of the state, but to the story the new rulers wished to tell. And when Granada, the last jewel of Al-Andalus, fell in 1492 AD, a different kind of conquest began, the conquest of memory. For the greatest battles are not fought on fields of stone and dust, but in the stories we choose to remember, and the ones we choose to forget. After the fall, the new rulers moved swiftly. Mosques were converted into churches. Libraries were burned in public squares, where pages turned to ash as if knowledge itself were disappearing into smoke. Scholars were exiled or silenced. Names were changed. African and Arab identity was gradually scrubbed from the record. In paintings, the once brown faces of Moorish nobles and scholars were repainted with pale skin. History was not simply changed, it was sanitized. This erasure was not accidental. For Europe to tell the story of its own greatness, it needed to forget who had illuminated it. To claim the Renaissance as a birth of purely European genius, the memory of Africa's role had to be buried. And so, the Moors were recast not as scholars, poets, and builders, but as invaders. Their legacy was reduced to a footnote, their identity blurred until only fragments remained in language, song, and stone. Yet the evidence remains everywhere. In Spanish grammar, where thousands of words still drift like murmurs of Arabic breath, in the terraces and irrigation systems that continue to feed orchards and vineyards, in the patterns of architecture carved into arches that rise like unfolding prayers, in music that trembles with ancient longing. History can be hidden, but it cannot be erased forever. Memory is a river, and all rivers eventually return to the sea. Today, the truth is rising back to the surface. Scholars, historians, artists, and descendants are reclaiming the story of the Moors, not to rewrite history, but to restore it. The more we look, the more clearly we see. The foundations of modern Europe were not built by Europe alone. Africa was not on the outside looking in. Africa stood at the center. To recognize this is not to diminish any culture, but to elevate all of humanity. It is to remember that civilizations rise through exchange, through curiosity, through the willingness to learn from one another. The Moors were not saviors. They were not conquerors in the way history often frames such movements. They were bridges, carriers of memory between worlds. Their legacy continues in the way we calculate numbers, in the way we understand stars, in the medicines we use, in the architecture that shapes sacred spaces, in the very idea of the university as a home of knowledge. Their story is not simply African history, it is world history. And now, we return the story to the world. The Moors did not merely rule Spain, they transformed it. They lit a flame that allowed Europe to awaken from centuries of silence. This is not just a story of the past, it is a mirror. A reminder that history is not linear and greatness has many homes. A reminder that Africa has always been a cradle of civilization, not a shadow of it. And now, as we speak their names again, we reclaim not only their memory, but our own. This is the African history. Share this story. Leave your voice in the comments, and subscribe to join the restoration of our memory. Because the world forgot once, we will not let it forget again.